Hello, this is Models of Psychotherapy Part 1, and we will start out with getting a textbook definition of psychotherapy. Okay, so you see it in the roots of the word. You've got the psychology, and then you've got the therapy or the treatment. Psychotherapy, these are systematic interactions between client and therapist, and systematic meaning that the therapist is being very deliberate in how he or she is listening, or how he or she is directing the course of the conversation and the treatment. Psychotherapy uses psychological principles. And so here we're talking about borrowing from the science, but borrowing from all kinds of different areas of psychology. It could be developmental psychology, it could be learning, it could be cognitive processes. So from a variety of different fields of psychological principles, with the purpose of helping the client change his or her behavior, feelings, or way that they think. Okay. And the ultimate purpose there is to overcome abnormal behavior, particularly if there is abnormal behavior, like we talked about at the very beginning of the semester, or a DSM psychological diagnosis, to help the client solve problems or develop as an individual. And so the develop as an individual would be basically looking for growth, particularly personal growth or growth in relationships. Let me share, I'm going to show you an APA clip. I'll get to this clip here in a second. Here we go, finally. Okay, so.
If you're like most of us, you're no stranger to anxiety, stress, and depression. But what if there were a medicine that could take care of all these problems and many more, now and in the future? Introducing the pill you take once that makes you the best you can be. Fix-It-All. Fix-It-All is not available in North America, South America, Asia, Australia, Africa, Europe, Antarctica, or the North Pole.
In the real world, while some conditions require medication, there's no shortcut to being our best selves. Hard work and good tools can give you the long-term skills to live your life to the fullest. If you're looking for help, talk to a psychologist. Psychotherapy can help you effectively manage stress, anxiety, and depression. Side effects of psychotherapy may include better health, improved relationships, and higher self-esteem. Do not engage in psychotherapy while pursuing miracle cures that do not exist.
Okay, so that's a public service announcement from the American Psychological Association. And so let's get back to PowerPoint here. Okay, so now that we have our textbook definition, let's take a look at the types of individuals that would be considered to be mental health therapists in one way or another. So there are clinical psychologists who have either a PhD or a PsyD. I am a clinical psychologist with a PhD, and so that is a doctorate of philosophy. And I keep in mind, I had one philosophy course in undergrad, and that was it. The philosophy means doctorate of knowledge, and the PhD in clinical psych is training in scientific research. As a scientist, I do research and I publish, as well as training in clinical psych. The PsyD is the doctorate of psychology, and we now have, after many years of planning in our department, a PsyD program with the purpose of a PsyD degree is a very applied clinical degree where our students will conduct research with a master's thesis and a doctoral dissertation, but they were really trained with a rural emphasis to be able to go set up private practice or set up in a mental health clinic or set up in a medical clinic or set up in a school system where ideally they are going to be able to do psychological assessments and testing, as well as psychotherapy from children all the way up to the elderly. And so that's clinical psychologists. There are also counseling psychologists, there are several counseling psychologists over at the ASU Counseling Center, as an example. The counseling psychologists have more of an emphasis on working with psychological diagnoses, but also more educational achievement. And so keep in mind, the mission of our counseling center is to keep students healthy enough to keep them in school at ASU. And so it makes a lot of sense that the counseling center has hired these PhDs or PsyDs in counseling psychology. Psychological associates or technicians, these would be individuals who have a Master of Arts degree or Master of Science degree. We used to have, prior to our PsyD, we had a Master of Arts degree in clinical psych in our department. It is interesting that only about 11 states now license master's level psychologists. And that is because the American Psychological Association holds the value that a true psychologist is somebody who has a doctoral degree. It's very much like in the field of medicine. You are not a medical doctor until you get a doctor of medicine or a doctor of osteopathic medicine degree. If you are a nurse practitioner with a master's degree, or you are a physician's assistant with a master's degree, you are not a medical doctor. So our American Psychological Association holds the stance that you're not a psychologist unless you have a doctoral degree. So the states that license these master's level individual call them either psychological associates or they call them psychological technicians. North Carolina right now still does license master's level individuals, but we think that pretty soon APA is going to push, and that might be ending because all of the master's programs in the state have now risen up to the doctoral level. Wilmington has, Charlotte has, and then ASU and Western are doing that right now. We've moved up to the PsyD. Psychiatrists are medical doctors or doctors of osteopathic medicine. And so they're medical doctors first, and then they go into, in their residency, and specialize in psychiatry. Historically, psychiatrists practiced a good bit of psychotherapy, but nowadays most psychiatrists do medication management. That's more kind of their role, managing medication, where the other mental health professionals are doing the talk therapy or the psychotherapy. Social workers, social work is a very practical degree, particularly at the master's level. Whereas most states don't necessarily license master's level psychologists anymore, all states license master's level social workers. So the MSW is a very practical degree. Also, the state, just about every state will license a licensed professional counselor. So the Master of Social Work, Doctor of Social Work, there are marriage and family therapists who have either a Master of Arts, Master of Science, could be a Master of Divinity, which would be a religious counseling degree, or a PhD. Keep in mind that ASU has a Master's in Social Work, ASU has a Marriage and Family Therapy program, and then the last one down here, is the Licensed Professional Counselor. And we have the Master of Arts here at ASU. It's over in the College of Education. We are friends with all of these programs, but it is a separate program from the psychology program. LPC is also a very practical degree because just about every state in the United States still recognizes them. So that's the mental health professionals. Okay. So let's move into the models of psychotherapy. And this is going to map onto, at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about these different psychological models or orientations. And now what we're going to do is kind of talk about not necessarily as much as how they conceptualize abnormal behavior, but how in thinking in these models, how we would treat abnormal behavior. So first of all, psychodynamics. So this started with Sigmund Freud. And remember that he talked about a lot of like problems are rooted in childhood. Remember, as individuals try to negotiate those psychosexual stages of development, Freud would say if they were too delayed in negotiating them or too abrupt in moving through them, then you could end up with psychological problems. And so in the psychodynamic model, problems are rooted in childhood from these unconscious conflicts of the mind. And there's a lot about personality and a lot about interpersonal relationships in the psychodynamic model. In traditional psychoanalysis, and this is a true picture of Freud's couch, In traditional psychoanalysis, the client would actually lie on the couch and the psychodynamic therapist would sort of sit behind the person's head and listen to them free associate. So just talk about whatever was on their mind, because free association was supposed to be that unconscious material come up front. And then there was a lot of emphasis on dream analyses too, thinking that there was a lot of symbolism that occurred in dreaming that could be relevant to understanding that person's unconscious. And again, therapists would sort of sit back, maybe take notes. The therapist wouldn't say a whole lot. It'd be kind of like, you know, that's interesting. And they relied on what is called the urge to utter. And so, you know, imagine if you're in a situation where somebody is expecting you to talk and you're lying there. A lot of times they lie there and smoke, not very healthy, but anyways, and you're lying there. At some point in time, you want to fill the silence. And so you would start just sort of like, you know, talking. That would be the free association. Traditional psychoanalysis would last for like an hour twice a week for years, to really try to get at the unconscious material. Nowadays, very few individuals practice traditional psychoanalysis. It's just not considered to be very practical. And I can't imagine how expensive that would be to see a therapist twice a week for years. Anyways, modern psychodynamic therapy, which one of the common forms of modern psychodynamic therapy is interpersonal therapy, IPT. And this is going to focus also kind of on childhood and how personality gets formed, and personality, particularly if there's any rigidity in personality or personality disorders or that type of thing. But it's really going to be focusing on the health of the person's personality vis-a-vis how their personality affects relationships. So hence the interpersonal therapy. Modern IPT or modern psychodynamic therapy is more sitting on chairs or sitting on couches face to face, talking back and forth with the therapist. So it's a lot more active than that traditional psychoanalysis. The Humanistic Existential, if you remember when we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, it's more about thinking about the things that make us human beings, that separate us from other mammals, and the experiences that we have, our ability to think, our ability to feel a range of emotions. And then also thinking about existential, meaning existence. And in the existential piece, like why are we here? Like, what is the meaning of life? And what is this unique thing that we experience as humans that other mammals do not? It's very focused, unlike psychoanalysis, thinking way back into childhood, thinking way back into the unconscious. The humanistic existential therapists are very much here and now, and your personal subjective experience, knowing that everybody has a unique way of perceiving the world and has had unique life experiences that bring them to that point. And the most well-known would be Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy. And so the idea is that the therapist is really focused and centered on the client and his or her unique being. Okay. And these are some of the key things that the counselor or the psychologist offers in client-centered therapy. And I can let you all know that in modern day psychotherapies, this is the starting point in training for our students, for our doctoral students. So we give them this humanistic client-centered psychotherapy. We teach them how to listen and do these things. And then once the students master those skills and those competencies, then we start building the other psychotherapies that are more active and directive on top of those skills. So if any of you've ever participated in any of the volunteer client interviews, what you were probably getting was a student therapist who was practicing these skills. So the first thing in client-centered therapy is to provide some sense of unconditional positive regard. We know that people who were raised with a parent or a guardian or a relative or parents that gave them unconditional love, even though they had expectations for their kids, are healthier individuals than kids that were raised with a guardian or parents or relatives who did not feel like they had that unconditional love or unconditional positive regard. And so this is so important in people's psychological well-being. So what it means from the therapist standpoint is that we get in there. If the client is just naturally likable, then we go for it. You know, we've got it. Every now and then we might be working with somebody who kind of rubs us wrong a little bit, or we don't feel like they're just naturally likable, as an example. And then we have to figure out how to find that. We have to find something about that particular client that we can find likable. If you remember the client I talked about who had the brutal sexual abuse as a child, there were times where he made me feel very uncomfortable, and he was kind of challenging to naturally like. And whenever I would feel that way, I would have to pull upon my admiration for the fact that this guy survived what he went through, and he certainly didn't deserve to go what he went through in that violent physical sexual abuse. And he was trying to lead a good life, and he was trying to be a good guy, and he was trying to be a good husband, and he was trying to be a good father. And I would have to call upon that at times to be like, you know, dude, you know, wow, you are trying. Second thing that we do in client-centered therapy is a lot of empathic understanding, really listening to the content of what clients are saying, really listening to their feelings, getting in there with them, and really, you know, sort of standing in their shoes kind of thing. And so empathy, lots of empathy. We select our students. We make sure that our students have natural empathy, because empathy is really challenging to train. You've got to kind of have a good heart, and you got to kind of have that. And then we really train how to bolster that in psychologist training. Genuineness would be not being fake. And this is something that we really kind of emphasize in training students. I know I had a supervisor earlier in my training who was kind of stern and not very emotional. And so I was modeling that in my therapy with my clients. I was trying to be very professional and not look my young age at the time, that type of thing. And then I had on an eating disorders rotation, I had marriage and family therapists as my supervisors. And I still remember a supervision session where me and my male supervisor were watching tape of me with a client. And there was a point where my client said something really funny, and it cracked me up. And I just, like, you know, I just laughed. I just thought it was really entertaining. And my therapist stopped the tape at that point, and I was like, oh crap, I'm going to be in trouble here, because I kind of broke the professionalism. And he was such a wonderful supervisor, and he said, that's it. And I was like, that's what? He's like, that's you being you. And it was like, oh yeah, that was me. She said something funny and it cracked me up. And then I realized over time that, and it's hard when you're in training, because you're trying to learn these things. You're trying to be all these certain things, like, again, be very professional. And I realized over time that, yeah, it's kind of like actors would say that when they're acting, they're them, but then they're calling upon other elements of themselves. And so being genuine is important. The congruence is sort of about like having thoughts and feelings and behavior be congruent. And so we're looking for this in our clients. And if we see incongruence, we try to call upon that. And that's going to build on our genuineness. So like, let's say I have a client who's telling me one thing, but I'm getting this emotional read that's something very different. In my genuineness, I'm going to want to get in there and kind of call them out on that. Okay, so that's Roger's client-centered psychotherapy. Pearl's gestalt therapy. I have not had much experience with gestalt therapy, but I do want to talk a little bit about, I had a supervisor who was a psychiatrist on when I was doing inpatient eating disorders treatment. And I'll tell you about two of the things that I witnessed going on there, that while I was watching it, I was like flabbergasted with it. So I'm in this inpatient eating disorders program, and I would do group therapy with the marriage and family therapist and some individual therapy. And then the psychiatrist would run group therapy. And this particular psychiatrist would do some pretty brave types of things. So in our inpatient program, we had individuals with anorexia that were malnourished and quite emaciated. We had patients with mainly diagnosis bulimia nervosa, and they ranged anywhere from underweight to slightly overweight. And then we had in our program individuals with binge eating disorder who were considered to be morbidly obese. So we have all this mixture of these people in the group. And so I go in, I sit down, I'm ready to kind of shadow on what's going on in the psychiatrist group therapy that day. And he comes in and he says, "Hey, everybody stand up." Except for me, I was just watching. So he had all the patients stand up and he said, "Line up according to your weight and your body size." And I was sitting there like, oh my gosh, these people have eating disorders. Do you know how sensitive body image issues are? Right. And so I'm watching this, I'm like, whoa. But what was fascinating about it was how quickly they were capable of doing it. Like, there wasn't like, he's just like, "You're going to do this." And they got up and they just lined up. And then he would process it. And I'm sitting there like, whoa, what's going on? And he would do stuff like go to people in the middle and go, "You're in the middle. You're not the thinnest. You're not the heaviest. You're in the middle. What does it feel like to be average?" And they would process that. And then he would do stuff like go to the most anorexic, the gal's standing there. She's got the NG tube feeding her because she's so malnourished. She's being fed through her stomach, up in her sinuses, down into her stomach. So they're pumping in nutrition constantly around the clock. And he's like, "You're the sickest. You're the thinnest, but you're the sickest and you're the closest to death. What's that like?" And then they would process it. And then he would go down the line to the individual with obesity and say, "You just heard these individuals complaining that they feel fat when they're obviously very, very thin, but you have a larger body. What's that like hearing that in this group?" Okay. It was, I would not pull that off. I would never do that. But it was amazing how powerful it was, because what he made evident was what everybody was thinking, that these patients in this program had sized everyone up and they knew exactly how to line up. And it was a very powerful kind of processing type of thing. Another thing that we do in Gestalt would be empty chair work. So this would be relationship work using an empty chair. So having a client talk to somebody else who's in a chair that's empty, and or you have them switch and be that other person talking back to them. So as an example, I had this woman client who kept complaining to me that her husband didn't listen to her. Her husband didn't respect her perspective, didn't respect her feelings, would not listen to her. And finally, I was like, okay, let's try this empty chair thing. And I'm like, okay, I pulled a chair over and I was like, okay, imagine he's right there in front of you. Now, you told me that you had a really stressful experience last week. Explain it to him, thoughts and feelings. Because again, she's complaining he doesn't listen to her. Well, what that exercise did was help me realize, no, it's not, I didn't know, maybe he can't listen to her. I don't know, maybe he wasn't very good at that. But the problem that I was seeing is she couldn't express her perspective. She could not express how she feels. Like, I would have to work hard in therapy to kind of pull that stuff out of her. And I had training on how to do that. And he did not have training on how to do that. So basically, she's put the problem in his chair and said, the problem is he doesn't listen. And he's just like, typical masculine guy kind of thing, stereotyping him, when really the issue was she had to get in touch with her feelings and learn the skills of how to express them. And so that really shifted the type of work that we were doing in therapy together. Okay. Now we're moving on to cognitive psychology, and we've got two different ways of people that have been really instrumental in forming cognitive therapy. Aaron Beck is the one that focuses more on these cognitive errors, and Albert Ellis is more focusing on these core beliefs or core values that are problematic for people. Okay. So let's talk about, this is Aaron Beck and some common cognitive distortions that people do. And one of the things that we do in cognitive therapy is we give people handouts, and we spend time going through each of these. And then we have clients try to identify, do they do these things or do they not do these things? And then further deeper in cognitive therapy, we have clients keep thought records. So particularly when they're having problematic feelings or problematic behaviors, we have them sit and write stream of consciousness thought records. And then we concretely in therapy, we look at identifying these cognitive distortions. And then we help clients go from a distorted way of thinking about that situation and to moving into a healthier or more neutral or more positive way of thinking about that situation, and practicing that new way of thinking until it becomes rote, until it becomes a natural way of thinking. Okay. And many of you are going to identify yourselves in some of these. That's okay. We're all human beings. We all do this sometimes. And so let's kind of go through these. So mind reading. This happens a lot in couples who've been together for a long time, or family members, or friends who feel like they know each other really well. And it's the tendency to assume what other people think rather than good communication and clarifying a person's perspective or how they feel or what they're thinking. And so this is where we get ourselves into trouble with the assumption, the assume, and you all have probably heard the break it down. When we assume, we make an ass of you and me. And so basically, when you get into thinking about us as human beings, most interpersonal conflict or interpersonal tension is usually a result of poor communication. So a lot of times there's mind reading. It's like, well, I know how you think, and I know you're thinking that's a bad thing about me, and blah, 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 you know, no, instead of like really kind of talking stuff out. The flip side of that is almost like sending messages. I grew up in a household where I had a parent who at times would get upset with the other parent and would do the silent treatment. And the silent treatment was sort of this kind of thing of like, well, I've got all these thoughts for you, but I'm going to punish you by being quiet and not communicating, which was not a real healthy thing to do. And I've been really kind of cognizant in my adult life to not repeat the silent treatment when I'm upset with people, but instead to offer up, you know, would there be a time that would be good for you that we can kind of talk this through? Okay. The worst thing you can say in a relationship is we need to talk, because that certainly doesn't go well. You've got to do that motivational interview. Is there a good time where we could talk? Okay. So mind reading. All or none thinking. This it really kind of fits into rigidity. We see this a lot in perfectionism. We see this a lot in personality disorders. And this is when we tend to interpret events as black or white, all or none, when most of the world exists in the gray area. And so we look for this kind of rigidity, and we really help individuals realize that, you know, there's not always just right and wrong. I was just talking with a parent where I'm seeing a teenage client just the other day, and mom was very concerned with, am I doing this right or am I doing this wrong? Am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? And at one point, you know, I kept saying, because she was reading stuff on the internet going, I think I'm doing it wrong. And I just assured her she was acting out of intuition in a lot of situations, and it was actually pretty good. But I also let her know that, you know, kids are fine if they know their parents love them and they know their parents are doing the best they can to parent them, and their parents are doing a good job of asking how the kid's doing and really listening. And I just assured her that it wasn't right or wrong. You know, she was being a good parent, and her concern, even wanting to talk with me, showed that she was being a good parent. So getting her out of that all or none. Overgeneralization. This is when we tend to draw a larger general conclusion from a smaller isolated event. And so one example I saw a client who came in to see me and said, I asked, you know, why are you here today? She said, well, I'm here because I'm a failure. And I said, so, you know, what has gotten you thinking you're a failure? And she said, well, I failed last semester. Like like in school, in college. And I was like, oh, well, tell me about last semester. And then we break it down. And what I realize is that she actually got good grades, A's and B's in all of her classes, except for her math class. And she indeed failed her math class. She got an F in her math class. And it was one of those, I was like, whoa, wow. So first of all, you told me you're a failure. Second of all, that's because you failed last semester. In reality, you failed one class. Okay. And what that kind of told me after we talked a little bit more about that math class is like, dude, you know, maybe you're not going to be a physicist, or maybe you're not going to be an engineer, or maybe you're not going to be a mathematician. But that by all means does not mean that you're not a good person and that you cannot achieve in other career paths. So she was definitely overgeneralizing. Catastrophizing. This is a fun one to sit and just watch it explode in front of you. This is when a person makes a mountain out of a molehill. So they think the worst possible scenario will occur. I'll tell you about this client that I saw that was classic. So she had been in her first romantic relationship and really loved the guy that she was dating. And when she thought things were going fine, he dumps her and breaks her heart. And she comes to me kind of depressed with a broken heart. And I'm working with her. And she gets to a point where she's feeling better about herself. So then I'm encouraging her, get back out there, girl, you know, get back out there and date. And she had guys asking her out and had just been so feeling down from being dumped that she just didn't say yes to any of them. So she finally agrees. I'm encouraging her. She goes out on a date and she comes back to the next session with me. And I was like, so how did it go? And she sits in front of me and she's like, it was a disaster. And then she starts telling me about the disaster. She's like, oh, we didn't have anything in common. And he didn't like my sense of humor. And I found his sense of humor to be offensive. And it was just like, it didn't go well. And, you know, like, I don't think I'm dateable right now. And he's going to tell all his friends, like, nobody ever asked her out again. It was a horrible date. It's so uncomfortable. Don't do it. And then she keeps going and she's like, oh, and then I'm not going to get married. And my mom really wants grandkids. And you know what? I'm going to be that old lady with all the cats. It's like, whew, girl, back up. One bad date. Yeah. Don't marry this guy. I don't think it's going to work out, but that does not mean that it is not possible for you to find other romantic relationships. Big catastrophizing. Arbitrary or superstitious inference. This is when we reach a conclusion in the absence of real evidence. And so superstitious thinking or jumping arbitrary meaning random, we're making a random conclusion without evidence. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So I worked with this client who had epilepsy, had seizure disorder, and had some really embarrassing events when he was younger. So as an example, being a child in school, having a seizure, and waking up out of the seizure and having wet his pants and having kids laughing at him and making fun of him for him wetting his pants during a seizure, as an example. Engaged in all this superstitious behavior because was very fearful that any kind of weird lighting could bring on a seizure at any moment. And so very disabling for him initially because he would not use computers. He kept lighting very dim in all the rooms, could not use a cell phone as an example. So you could see how in modern day times, how debilitating that would be if you're afraid any kind of artificial light would give you a seizure. So I'm trying to do exposure therapy. I'm trying to expose him to, like, you know, let's spend some time with you on a phone screen, looking at my phone screen, and let's just see if it gives you a seizure, that type of thing. And he's reluctant. He doesn't want to do it. So I finally was like, okay, when was the last time you had a seizure? Because he's been on medication for years. And actually the medication was controlling and preventing seizures very well. So he's in his 20s when I'm working with him. And he's like, okay, the last time I had a seizure was when I was 13. So I started doing the math. Okay, so it's been 8 years since you've had a seizure. That evidence tells me that the medication he was on was doing a really good job. But he threw at me an arbitrary superstitious inference. So I'm like, okay, it's been 8 years since you've had a seizure. And he was like, oh my gosh, I'm due for one any moment now. Okay. Can you see how irrational that is? The evidence was saying he was in good shape with the medication. It was controlling the seizures. And eventually we were able to get around that and he was able to start exposing himself to artificial light. The second one I want to talk about is I was watching March Madness, and there was a guy being interviewed, one of the basketball players for a college team, and he gives a shout out to his mom. I'm like, that's a good boy. But then there's a point where he talks about playing this team and how his team had historically lost most of the games in playing this other team. Now, keep in mind, basketball games and from year to year are independent from your history, but he comes out with an arbitrary inference, and I was like, oh dude. He said, well, historically we've lost most of our games to this team, so that means in the law of averages we're due to win. And I was like, what is this law of averages? And then I got to thinking about it. Well, we call that karma. Okay. We call it karma, and I like to use karma. I like to talk about karma every now and then. It's kind of fun to do that. But in reality, there is no law of averages. When teams play one another, it does not have to average out to 50-50 in terms of wins and losses. Okay, that's just not how it works. It's an independent event. Okay, like tossing, it's not tossing a coin kind of thing. Okay, I am going to record now.